Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 22 May 2024. It is the 119th anniversary of the birth of Paul Oskar Kristeller, who was born in Berlin on this date in 1905. Kristeller is most widely known for a popular anthology of Renaissance philosophy, and I quoted from Kristeller in my episode about Renaissance philosopher Franciscus Patricius. And here is Kristeller on the historiography of Renaissance humanists. Quote, "The humanist works on history have a number of peculiarities, both good and bad. They are often written in a highly rhetorical Latin, and they show the influence of classical historiography in the use of fictitious speeches. Since they are usually commissioned by the very state or city whose history has to be written, there is an element of eulogy and of regional or dynastic bias, something which I understand is not entirely absent from national histories of modern times. On the other hand, the humanists usually did not place much credence in miracles and avoided theological speculations, and they tend to account for historical events on a strictly rational basis. Moreover, they often had access to the archives and original documents illustrating the subject matter of their history and employed more exacting standards of documentation and historical criticism than had been the custom during the preceding centuries. Valla's treatise on the donation of Constantine is a famous example of historical criticism in the 15th century. In the 16th, we might single out humanists such as Sigonius, who must be considered in their erudition and critical acumen as the direct forerunners of the great historians of the 17th and 18th centuries," unquote. But Kristeller wasn't exclusively a Renaissance scholar. He was also fully engaged in the philosophy of his time. He edited and wrote the introduction to Siegfried Kracauer's book on philosophy of history, the Last Things Before the Last. In my episode on Kracauer, I quoted from Kristeller's introduction to Kracauer. And of Kracauer's book, Kristeller wrote, quote, "I profoundly agree with the spirit out of which all of this work was written," unquote. So at least some of what he says about Kracauer applies to his own conception of history. In his foreword to Kracauer, Kristeller wrote, quote, "On several important issues, Kracauer hesitates to give a definitive solution, but rather formulates a problem and thus lays the ground for further thought. The discrepancy between general and special history, or as he calls it, macro and micro history, represents a serious dilemma. Kracauer seems to think that the results of special research are so complicated and so resistant to generalization that most of them must be ignored by the general historian. I tend to be slightly more hopeful and to believe that the results of special research after some lapse of time will penetrate general histories and that the diversity of contradictory details can be handled in terms of comparative and qualified statements," unquote. And another quote also from the same introduction to Kracauer, quote, "Another basic dilemma that Kracauer forcefully presents but does not resolve is that between chronological time and shape-timed, or between the general sequence of all events occurring at a given period and the specific sequences peculiar to one particular area or tradition. Again, I should be inclined to be more optimistic and try to lay the stress on the pluralism of cultural history while maintaining the concept of universal cultural history, at least as a regulative idea in the Kantian sense," unquote. So Kristeller presents himself as being a little more sympathetic to the possibility of a philosophically informed history eventually coming into being, or what we could call a macro historical account, than Kracauer was. But Kristeller is also willing to grant significant concessions to the ideographic conception of history, which seems to be implicitly Kracauer's point of view. In another place in the same foreword, Kristeller notes that Kracauer is less interested in philosophers discussing history than in the actual practices of historians. So he shouldn't be surprised at Kracauer's philosophical skepticism, which Kristeller does not fully share, though he implies that his point of departure in philosophy of history is similar to that of Kracauer's. As I discussed in my episode on Morton White, there is a tension in those philosophers of history that claim to follow the lead of practicing historians because they want to borrow the authority of the historian within his own discipline, but they rarely want to follow the historian's lead in all matters theoretical, you could say. But many historians leave no theoretical lead, or a very slim lead at best, for philosophers to follow. This might be better expressed as there being an overlap between the practicing historian and the philosopher who takes his inspiration from the practicing historians. Where exactly is the overlap between the practicing historian and the philosopher of history, and how extensive ought it to be? More often than not, the overlap is an idiographic orientation toward historical knowledge, along with the conviction that philosophers seeking nomothetic explanations have gotten lost in specifically philosophical problems that aren't firmly rooted in history and in the study of history. On the other hand, there is a perceived gap between historians and philosophers of history who make no pretense of taking their talking points from historians, which is what I just called philosophers discussing history, in contradistinction to philosophers discussing the work of practicing historians. It's worth mentioning in this context that there is a temperamental difference among those philosophers who are impatient with their colleagues who they see as getting too deep in the weeds on specifically philosophical problems, and those philosophers who are impatient with their colleagues who get too deep in the weeds on specific disciplinary questions that are not part of philosophy proper. At least they have their impatience with each other in common. But for my part, I think it makes perfectly good sense that philosophers should get deeply embedded in specifically philosophical problems, whether related to history or not. But there is a certain bad faith about this at the present time, probably in envy of science and the progress of science over the last century or so. We can see more hints of Kristeller's idiographic epistemic orientation in a 1943 paper that he co-authored with Lincoln Rees, Some Remarks on the Method of History. In this paper, the authors wade into the venerable question of historical methodology, seeming to come down on the side of Dilthey, Windelband, Rickert, and Isaiah Berlin, among others, that history has a method of its own, and that this is a method of particularity and not of general laws. That is, a method that is idiographic rather than nomothetic. And from the paper, quote, "The special contribution of the historian is the reconstruction and interpretation of specific events. It results from the combination of elements united by the historian and made accessible to the reader. Every element of that combination must be supported by the proper evidence, and thus the whole combination must be verifiable. It is a picture rather than a causal generalization. Though it includes causal relations, it is not itself a causal relation. For this reason, narrative rather than generalization is the only possible mode of presentation of the historical event," unquote. However, Kristeller goes a little further along than most philosophers of history who would contend that the historical method is not that of the natural sciences. He places this unique historical method and its narrative products in a larger context that includes rather than rejects natural sciences and philosophy of history. Quote, "We have said that universal laws or rules have no place in the actual work of the historian, which consists in fact-finding and interpretation, but that they do have their place before and after this work and outside history. They belong to a different field, which we may prefer to call sociology, or rather the philosophy of history. Since the philosophy of history will make use of the work of the historian, and to a certain extent it will provide him with the guiding ideas for his work. It is this latter fact which explains why the historian himself very often is also a philosopher of history, and rightly so. This accounts for the point of view we have discussed above, that is, that some people have taken the philosophical statements of great historians as authoritative statements about the actual method of historical investigation. The main requirement for such a philosophy of history is that it should be critical, not dogmatic, to use the Kantian terms. What it says about general laws of history should be tentative and flexible, since the precise manner in which these rules should be applied is a matter of debate, and should be subjected to the test of further historical research. Otherwise, it is as harmful to historical research as general metaphysical preconceptions are and have been to the progress of the natural sciences," unquote. Kristeller is saying here that philosophy of history is distinct from history itself, and part of its task is to place history in a larger epistemological framework, which latter would include the methodologies excluded from historical inquiry narrowly considered. But I don't think that many historians are likely to take kindly to the idea of philosophers of history providing them with guiding ideas for their work, which he implies is another task of the philosophy of history, though Kristeller has formulated this a little bit ambiguously so that we could give his sentence the opposite meaning of what I have initially construed it here, namely that the philosopher of history, rather, should be taking his guiding ideas from history. At the same time, Kristeller holds that the historian is also a philosopher of history, or at least in some cases, or at some times. This is a theme that I've discussed in several episodes, for example, quoting Hayden White on every history involving an implicit philosophy of history. I think that was in the episode on philosophy of history before Augustine. One of the distinctions we can draw within the philosophy of history is between those who hold that philosophical ideas distort and contaminate history, which ideally should be a bare account of facts, so that true history is innocent of all philosophy, and those who hold that history involves philosophical presuppositions, whether or not an historian wants to acknowledge his use of them, or whether or not he is aware of his use of them. An overlapping distinction with this is that between the historian as historian and the historian as philosopher of history, because one and the same person might put on the hat of an historian and write history, and then swap his historian's hat for the hat of the philosopher of history, and in this way provide his own guidance and integrate his strictly historical work into a larger epistemic framework. In this way, a philosopher could provide the guiding ideas for a history because they are his own ideas. And in this context, when the historian and the philosopher are the same person by turns, but taking different roles, this is the same thing as historians providing the guiding ideas for philosophers. The same year as Kristeller's paper with Lincoln Race appeared, 1943, Morton White responded directly to them in a note on the method of history, and he too goes a little beyond the familiar dialectic and keeps moving the ball forward, you could say. And this is Morton White, quote, "In general, I think it is rare to find disciplines distinguished from each other solely on the basis of the number of logical concepts they employ. In this case, as far as I am able to say, Rees and Kristeller would have us rigidly separate two disciplines simply because of them. One of them employs the logical operation of generalization and quantification, whereas the other does not. On the whole, I think the history of the empirical sciences teaches us that this divorce is a rare one. Moreover, the history of methodology teaches us that it is a dangerous one. For these reasons, I think that Rees and Kristeller are wrong in their analysis of the nature of historical statements. And not only that, historians who practice as if Rees and Kristeller were right would do well to change their procedures," unquote. Both Kristeller and White were trying to get at the bigger picture, but each of them sees a slightly different big picture. Hence, there's a distinct role for history in each of their big pictures, and a distinct role for the wider epistemic framework within history is presumably embedded. As recently as 2018, Kristeller wrote in his paper, Philosophy and its Historiography, quote, "Philosophers who claim to explore the status of historical knowledge have written about general laws of history and about causal explanation. These topics may concern the philosopher of history, but also the sociologist or anthropologist, but they are speculative and derivative and at best marginal for the practicing historian or philologist," unquote. Again, here we see the ideographic orientation and the assumption of the effective irrelevance of philosophy to history. Though I'm not sure how Kristeller's dismissive attitude to philosophy in relation to history is to be squared with his claim that the historian could take the directives of philosophers for the guiding ideas of his work. But as we saw, and as I said, this claim can be interpreted in the reverse sense that philosophers of history should take their guiding ideas from historians. Kristeller's views on philosophy of history did not substantially change between 1943 and 1985, as he is still making the same point, but here it has been shorn from his larger point about from his earlier writings about the reunification of knowledge within a larger framework that not only includes historical knowledge, but the rest of scientific knowledge. The previous quote that I just gave from Kristeller was used by Fons de Wolf in his 2018 paper, Revisiting Hempel's 1942 Contribution to the Philosophy of History. De Wolf concludes his paper with the following observation, quote, "The disappearance of the Windelbandian problem left open what kind of philosophical questions one could ask about the historical sciences. Here, Hempel's paper saw its most visible contribution. It suggested that the centrality of a philosophical concept had not yet received much analytical attention, namely explanation. In Hempel's and Oppenheim's 1948 paper, Studies in the Logical Explanation, explanation becomes a central concept for understanding scientific activity in general, and thus a prime object of analysis for the philosophy of science as a discipline. This, in turn, was refracted into an analytic philosophy of history in the 1950s and 1960s, focused its debate around historical explanation. Thus, when Drey looks back at 4 decades of analytical philosophy of history and lauds Hempel's 1942 paper, he testifies to these shifts that radically changed the methodological and conceptual norms for philosophy of history. And when Kristeller laments the path of the philosophy of history in the 20th century, he also attests to these shifts, but evaluates them differently, since it is his methodological and conceptual voice that became lost in the disciplinary norms of the philosophy of science and the history of philosophy of history after the Second World War, unquote. That was de Wolf in his 2018 paper. What de Wolf calls the Windelbandian problem, as far as I can ascertain in this context, is the neo-Kantian understanding of logic as a transcendental logic, which is to say, determining the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, which in the present case means the conditions of the possibility of historical knowledge. We can find this in Windelband's short book in English. It was made into a book in English, but it was originally written as an encyclopedia article. Anyway, the book in English, Theories of Logic, which I quoted from in my episode on Windelband. Windelband's conception of logic is much more comprehensive than that of Hempel. It was the disappearance of this comprehensive point of view in logic that led Anglo-American philosophers of history following Hempel to think of logic exclusively as an extensionalist modern formal logic, which is all about determining the conditions of valid inference. The extensionalist conception of logic, which is pervasive in contemporary mathematical logic, as well as in analytical philosophy that is largely built on mathematical logic, is prima facie less relevant to history than traditional logic. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is de Wolf's point about the different valuations of this historical development made by Drey and Kristeller. Logic has, in a sense, gotten trapped into this current extensionalist incarnation by its own precision because nobody wants to give up that precision. But that leaves a great deal of what we would like to think of as rational thought and rational inquiry without the immediate assistance of logic, because the logic we have is not easily applicable to these spheres. We can shift this problem a bit by recasting it from the problem of the role of logical inference in historical explanation to the role of rationality in historical inquiry, or the intelligibility of history. Whether or not historical explanation conforms to canons of extensionalist validity is a much narrower question than whether historical inquiry is a rational enterprise and whether history itself is intelligible. Certainly, Morton White and Kristeller have somewhat divergent conceptions of scientific rationality and therefore different conditions for the intelligibility of history. De Wolf formulates this in terms of the logic employed in historical explanation. Above, I characterized it in terms of a different conception of how history fits into the bigger picture of human knowledge. But the Windelbandian problem, in the larger sense, in the sense of whether history has its own distinctive methodology, which is in turn the perennial problem of whether history is a science or not, has not disappeared. This problem can be temporarily papered over, but it always returns, and it will continue to return until we formulate a conception of science and a conception of history sufficiently comprehensive that the two either fully coincide, and it can then be shown that history is definitively a science, or that the two overlap to some degree, and the extent to which they overlap and the points at which they overlap can be definitively shown. That or the two, history and science, are disjoint and they have nothing in common. This addresses the point about the reunification of knowledge in a larger framework, what I mentioned earlier, because if we're talking about a more comprehensive conception of science or a more comprehensive conception of history or the methodology, then we're talking about the larger epistemic framework in which both are embedded. History and philosophy of history are incomplete until we can do this. However, logic and science are also incomplete until we can do this. So happy birthday, Paul Oskar Kristeller, and thanks for listening.